From groundbreaking indie platformer Celeste to a modern reinvention of the classic God of War, 2018 was full of fantastic games. But those aren't the titles we want to talk about. Instead, we're taking a look at the ones that let us down in a big way. These are some of the worst games of 2018. The Fear Effect series can be traced all the way back to the original PlayStation, where Hannah and her crew starred in Fear Effect and Fear Effect 2 Retro Helix. These were games in the vein of Resident Evil, action horror titles that also incorporated a variety of puzzles, and both received pretty decent reviews. Fast forward to 2018 though, and we find a completely different Fear Effect title in our midst. One that is not very good. Fear Effect Sedna throws everything you may have known about Fear Effect out the window. Gone is the 3D third-person perspective gameplay, gone are the more tongue-in-cheek story elements. Instead, Fear Effect Sedna tries its hand at becoming a 2D stealth strategy game with a much more convoluted and, worse yet, boring narrative. Suffice it to say, it just couldn't pull off its new style, but honestly, who thought it needed a new style to begin with? Imagine you have an award-winning game on your hands. How do you take advantage of that and parlay it into more success? Well, for starters, you could fire the game's director, follow that up with stripping the soul out of the story and tacking on, zombies for some reason, and then seal the deal by implementing poor survival mechanics and boring melee combat mechanics. See what we did there? Yeah, rule of thumb is, don't do any of those things, but it looks like Konami didn't get the memo when they started development on Metal Gear Survive. You know all about the story of Konami and Hideo Kojima, no need to revisit that bittersweet saga, and you're probably familiar with Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain's near universal praise. But the latest Metal Gear game released by Konami is a shell of its predecessor, a game that exists simply to get more mileage out of the Fox engine and the Metal Gear name. It manages to downplay a lot of what made the Phantom Pain fun, while introducing things the game industry simply has too much of these days. Zombies, microtransactions, grindy gameplay, you know the drill. Honestly, we didn't want Metal Gear Survive to be bad. We really wanted to like it, but, well, here we are. Why you gotta do us like that, Konami?
Why are we still here? Just to suffer.
To its credit, Little Witch Academia Chamber of Time tries to do some cool things. The story itself is charming. A girl witch finds herself reliving the last day of witching school over and over, with the game focusing on her quest toward breaking the evil spell. And the art in the game is beautiful, paying homage to the anime it's based on, but everything else, it all falls flat. The game bounces between being a sort of fetch quest adventure and a dungeon crawling RPG. And according to Destructoid, quote, both of these games are awful. There's certainly a whole lot to do in the game thanks to its dozens upon dozens of side quests, but the unfortunate truth is that none of them are fun. Traversing the in-game world is super repetitive, and even when you finally unlock the ability to fast travel, the game hits you up for an in-game currency to unlock travel points and save points. Simply put, there's a lot to grind in this game and not much entertainment. For a game that looks as whimsical and pretty as Chamber of Time, that's a huge letdown. Square Enix is a tough company to get a handle on. It'll put out great games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider and complain about poor sales, and then it will sign off on a game like The Quiet Man, which just might be the worst game released in the year 2018. GameSpot's review of The Quiet Man can be summed up in this short phrase: inexplicable design. When you see those words attached to a game review, you know a game is not good. The Quiet Man is a sort of interactive movie. It mixes live-action film scenes with 3D action, and it fails to do either of those things well. The main character is deaf, and in order to better immerse you in his world, the game itself is almost entirely silent. That's a neat premise. The problem is, significant story beats appear to be happening during the game's cutscenes, and you can't hear them. Experimental? Maybe. Inexplicable design? Yeah, that too. The game doesn't even have subtitles! It's truly stunning that anyone thought this was a good idea. And when the game stops being a movie and starts being a video game, things don't get any better. The Quiet Man uses rudimentary beat-em-up mechanics a la The Bouncer, Square Enix's other forgettable brawler. And those are pretty much the only mechanics you encounter during the game. The combat is boring. Actually, everything is boring. All of The Quiet Man is boring and bad and just... oof. Even after an update called Answered, which added audio and subtitles to the mess, was released a week after the title's launch, players couldn't stomach the game. In fact, some felt that the voiceover, which they could access after playing through the original silent game, made The Quiet Man even worse.
And your little quiet man? Yeah, he's not gonna save your ass tonight.
There have been a lot of Dynasty Warriors games, including 9 in the main series and countless other spin-offs, but Dynasty Warriors 9 is the first in the mainline collection to try something completely different. It does away with the typical run here, fight people mission framework and instead opens up the world for players to explore. Unfortunately, all that openness doesn't necessarily make for a better experience. Dynasty Warriors 9 doesn't keep players on a rail like it used to, but the world it now lets players roam freely isn't all that exciting. It isn't brimming with interesting things to do, and there's no real reason for players to go off the beaten path. Sure, you can go off and collect items for crafting, but as IGN noted, the entire game is perfectly beatable without ever touching the crafting system, other than making healing items every now and then. What then is the point? There isn't much of one. The open world editions don't offer anything compelling, so Dynasty Warriors 9 feels a whole lot like every other Dynasty Warriors game, just way less fun to play. The original Shaq Fu is generally accepted to be a bad game, in spite of the fact that it received pretty mixed reviews at its release. GamePro, for instance, raved, "Shaq gets shrunk down to size, but his Shaq Fu stands tall." On the other hand, a reviewer at EGM stated, "It's got some decent moves and a story mode, but it doesn't have the technique." Reviews are, of course, opinions shared by those who have played through a game. So it shouldn't be too surprising that the opinions on Shaq's first foray into the fighting genre vary. But now Shaq stars in a second fighting game, and the opinions on this one are largely uniform. It sucks. The combat in Shaq Fu: A Legend Reborn is boring, which is kind of a big strike against a game like this. Plus, the story mode makes absolutely no sense.
You were the runt, so small I used to carry you around in my Dolce & Gabbana handbag on my tour of China. That's when I learned of the prophecy.
And the game is severely lacking in modes, including co-op. Destructoid called it a nostalgic joke taken too far. And Eurogamer Italy said, "It really fails to impress due to dull and repetitive mechanics and a total lack of depth." Those are fairly unkind words for a game that fans hoped would finally give Shaq the fighting game he deserved. Those fans donated nearly $460,000 to Shaq Fu: A Legend Reborn's Indiegogo campaign. And what did they get in return? The corpse of a game. It just goes to show all those nostalgia-obsessed gamers out there. Let dead IPs lie. The first Scribblenauts title arrived on the Nintendo DS all the way back in 2009. Since then, we've seen 5 more entries into the franchise, including the latest, Scribblenauts Showdown. The first game, along with the 4 that followed it, received generally good reviews. So what in the world happened to Showdown? It's worth noting that Showdown is the first game in the Scribblenauts series in nearly 5 years, and was not developed by the team at Fifth Cell, which had handled every title before. Instead, Shiver Entertainment led their talents to the title, so maybe that's why it's a vastly different game than those that came before. Showdown trades in the well-filled creative fun of the previous installments for a party game setup, and many of these games are all about tapping and moving things quickly. Most have little to do with words at all. It's a bummer for those who found educational or creative value in the earlier titles, and a pretty unnecessary change to a series that already had a unique twist. There is approximately a metric crap ton of zombie games these days, which is honestly one of the things that made Earthfall's premise so appealing. Earthfall aims to put an extraterrestrial spin on the State of Decay co-op formula. Instead of holding up and building up defenses against a zombie horde, you're battling back against invading aliens using a variety of high-tech weapons. It's just different enough to feel refreshing, at least that was the pitch. The reality? Earthfall is lame. Game Informer said the weapons in the game, quote, all look generic and lack a satisfying punch. The Sixth Axis elaborated on the game's console performance, stating that, quote, you'll have to cope with a frame rate that struggles to keep up. And PlayStation Universe said, quote, Earthfall feels like a cheap imitation of a great game. Most scores for the title wound up in the 2 to 5 out of 10 range. Not a great place for a video game to live. You'll probably want to avoid this one if it ever shows up in your atmosphere. Imagine if the Halo series spun off a new game that focused on you building and battling with a toy Master Chief. It'll be pretty weird, right? Well, that's essentially the premise behind the Gundam Breaker series of games, along with its newest entry, New Gundam Breaker. It's not a Gundam game in the proper sense. Rather, it's a sort of school simulator that also includes time for one very important hobby, putting together your own model Gundam, or Gunpla. and then using it to battle the Gundams of other students in VR. Now, that approach actually sounds pretty cool on paper, and you'll undoubtedly find fans of past games in the series, but there are a whole lot of problems with New Gundam Breaker. Reviews of the game have called out its awful controls and subpar frame rate, as well as a story campaign that doesn't offer a lot in the way of excitement. There aren't opinions that inspire a whole lot of confidence, and unsurprisingly, the game sits at a Metacritic score of 43 among professional critics. The only things this one breaks are the hearts of longtime Gundam fans everywhere. We're just as surprised as you are to see a Bethesda game on this list. Bethesda is home to so many great properties, like the Elder Scrolls games, the Dishonored series, the badass new Doom and Wolfenstein titles, and many, many more. Usually, you can count on Bethesda to deliver when a new game comes out. They aren't always perfect 10 out of 10 gems, but they're never straight up bad, and fans seem to really dig them, especially the Fallout series. Well, the streak had to end sometime. After decades of pumping out awesome stuff, Bethesda released Fallout 76, and yikes is it a clunker.
I know there are a lot of you who are really here or really wondering about Fallout 76.
Fans were highly skeptical when Bethesda announced an online multiplayer Fallout game at E3 2018. As it turns out, that skepticism was warranted. Fallout 76 doesn't contain a whole lot of what people like about the Fallout games, which makes Bethesda's patented game engine jank harder to overlook, and most critics took the game to task as a result. IGN said it tries to, quote, do everything and fails to do any of it well enough to form an identity, and GameSpot was even harder on Fallout 76, calling its world, quote, an inconsequential wasteland doomed to be nuked over and over again. It feels strange to say it, but it's probably best that you avoid this latest Fallout game. It's Fallout in name only, and it's not worth your time or your money. Fans of The Walking Dead have been treated pretty well in the video game space. Telltale Games gave us narratives that were as moving as their source material with its original Walking Dead episodic adventure series. It wasn't unreasonable then to have high hopes for Overkill's The Walking Dead, a first-person cooperative shooter from Starbreeze Studios, which had worked on beloved titles like Payday 2 and The Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay. Those high hopes, as it turns out, were a little too high. Overkill's The Walking Dead was a disaster of a game. The game reviewed poorly, with IGN calling it out for technical issues, unavoidable repetition, and a general lack of direction. And that's not all. The game's poor performance left Starbreeze in dire straits. And on top of that, the studio's offices in Sweden were raided by authorities on suspicion of insider trading. Players were just hoping to kill some zombies in a fun new Walking Dead game. Instead, the new Walking Dead game might have killed the studio that created it.